The atmosphere of the station designated as Prime Junction was thick with the scent of recycled ozone and the heavy, metallic musk of dozen different species. Yet for Vaelin Thorne, it smelled primarily of stagnant bureaucracy. He adjusted the seal on his environmental suit, the haptic sensors humming as they calibrated to the local gravity, which was set a fraction higher than the standard terrestrial constant. Around him, the bustle of the great hub was a chaotic dance of biology and engineering. Chitinous limbs clicked against the polished obsidian flooring, and bioluminescent crests flickered in a frantic rhythm of trade and negotiation. The humans were latecomers to this tapestry, a species often regarded with a mixture of mild curiosity and patronizing tolerance by the elder races who had charted the slipstream centuries before Earth had even mastered the steam engine. Vaelin ignored the stares of the towering Xylanthi as he made his way toward the docking gantry, where the cargo vessel starward bound was currently being stripped of its dignity by a team of automated inspectors. His task was simple in theory, but grueling in practice. He was to act as the primary liaison for the first independent human mining colony established on the fringes of the Uit Reach. The elder races, collective members of the Accordance, viewed the Uit Reach as a barren wasteland of frozen rock and useless dust. Yet the humans had found something there that defied the known laws of isotopic decay. Vaelin knew that if he could secure the transport permits today, the colony would thrive. If he failed, the 3,000 souls living in the hollowed-out shell of an asteroid would find their life support systems failing within the next local cycle. He reached the primary administrative kiosk, where a being known as a Thraxian sat, or rather hovered, behind a shimmering field of hard light data. The Thraxian possessed 4 eyes that moved independently, each one tracking a different stream of information, and its skin had the texture of weathered parchment. Vaelin waited for the customary 3 minutes of intentional silence, a traditional Thraxian power play designed to remind shorter-lived species of their insignificance in the grand timeline of the galaxy. He didn't fidget, nor did he check his chronometer. He simply stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a statue of Terran resolve amidst the swirling neon lights of the terminal. When the Thraxian finally deigned to acknowledge him, the sound was like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor. The creature spoke through a translator unit that hung around its neck, a device that turned its clicks and whistles into a toneless, artificial voice. It informed Vaelin that the permits for the Uit Reach extraction had been indefinitely suspended due to a clerical discrepancy regarding the orbital resonance of the mining facility. This was a lie, of course, a transparent attempt to extort a higher percentage of the mineral yield for the Accordance's central treasury. Vaelin felt a flicker of heat behind his ribs, the ancient, predatory fire that his ancestors had used to hunt mammoths across the tundra, but he kept his expression neutral. He had spent months studying the labyrinthine legal codes of the Accordance, memorizing the subclauses and the hidden provisos that the elder races used to keep the younger ones in a state of perpetual debt. He began to speak, his voice calm and measured, citing the Treaty of 3 Suns and the specific protections granted to non-aligned exploratory bodies. The Thraxian's eyes slowed their independent movement, eventually focusing all 4 lenses on Vaelin's face. It was a rare occurrence for a human to speak the language of law with such precision, especially a human who looked like he belonged in a machine shop rather than a courtroom. Vaelin pointed out that the orbital resonance of their facility was not a variable subject to Accordance jurisdiction, as the Uit Reach fell within the neutral buffer zone established after the last great conflict between the Xylanthi and the Thraxians themselves. By claiming jurisdiction now, the Accordance would be effectively declaring an annexation of the buffer zone, an act that would trigger a mandatory review by the High Arbiters. The Thraxian pulsed a deep, bruised purple, a sign of irritation, and began to type furiously into its hard light interface. It was looking for a loophole, a way to dismiss the small, soft creature standing before it, but Vaelin had anticipated this. He provided a data shard containing the precise gravitational telemetry of the mining site, proving that their presence was not only legal but beneficial to the stability of the surrounding sector. While the Thraxian processed the data, Vaelin allowed himself a moment to observe the other petitioners in the queue. There was a Grendel, a massive, six-legged beast with hide like rusted armor, pleading for a water allotment for its dying homeworld. There was a collective of sentient fungi from the damp moons of Jora, seeking permission to trade their spores for synthetic light emitters. These were the lesser races, the ones who had accepted the crumbs of the accordance in exchange for a peaceful, if subservient, existence. Humanity was different. Humanity had entered the galactic stage not with a plea for help, but with a series of questions that the elder races found deeply uncomfortable. They wanted to know why the slipstream gates were restricted, why the energy density of the core worlds was so much higher than the periphery, and why the history of the galaxy seemed to have been scrubbed of any mention of a predecessor civilization. This curiosity was what made them dangerous in the eyes of the Thraxians. It wasn't human weapons that scared the Accordance, it was human persistence. The administrator finally looked up, its purple hue fading into a dull gray of resignation. It tapped a final command into the console, and a digital seal appeared on Vaelin's terminal. The permits were granted, but the Thraxian added a verbal warning, its translator screeching with a hint of static. It warned him that while the law might protect them today, the Uit Reach was a place of ghosts and shadows, and that the Accordance would not send a rescue fleet when the humans inevitably uncovered something they were not meant to see. Vaelin took the data shard back, his fingers brushing against the cold metal, and gave a curt nod of thanks. He didn't tell the Thraxian that the humans had already found something, that the mineral they were mining wasn't a mineral at all, but the fragmented memory cores of a dead god. He didn't mention that the colony wasn't just a mining outpost, but a laboratory where some of the brightest minds of Earth were attempting to reverse engineer the very fabric of reality. He simply turned and walked away, his boots echoing with a steady, rhythmic thud that sounded like a heartbeat. As he exited the administrative wing and moved toward the industrial docks, Vaelin was intercepted by a human woman named Kalith. She was a navigator by trade, her eyes replaced with cybernetic optics that allowed her to see the shifting currents of the slipstream in real time. She looked worried, her hands hovering near the multi-tool at her belt. She asked if he had the permits, and when he showed her the seal, she let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for hours. But the relief was short-lived. She informed him that a scout ship from the Xylanthi hegemony had been spotted loitering near the edge of the Uit Reach. The Xylanthi were the enforcers of the Accordance, a warrior race that valued strength above all else, and they were notoriously impatient with legal technicalities. If they were there, it meant the Thraxians had already tipped them off, hoping that a random pirate attack or a navigational accident would solve their human problem without the need for a diplomatic incident. Vaelin felt a cold shiver go down his spine, not of fear, but of anticipation. They reached the Starward Bound, a ship that looked like a collection of pressurized cylinders and exposed wiring held together by stubbornness and welding torches. It was a beautiful eyesore, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of resource scarcity. Inside, the air was crisp and smelled of coffee and scorched electronics. The crew was small, only 12 people, but each one was an expert in a field that the Accordance considered obsolete. They used kinetic slugs instead of plasma bolts because kinetics couldn't be deflected by standard energy shielding. They used analog backup systems because digital viruses couldn't infect a physical switch. They were a pack of wolves living in a galaxy of pampered cats, and they knew it. Vaelin took his seat in the command chair, which was really just a repurposed pilot's seat from a decommissioned atmospheric shuttle. He ordered the engines to be brought to life, the low hum of the fusion reactor vibrating through the floorboards and into his bones. It was a familiar, comforting sensation, the feeling of power being harnessed and directed toward a singular purpose. The ship detached from the gantry with a series of muffled clunks and hissed steam as the umbilical lines were severed. Outside the viewscreen, the massive structure of Prime Junction began to shrink, its glittering lights becoming a singular point of brilliance against the velvet black of the void. Kalith took the controls, her fingers dancing across an interface that looked like a chaotic mess of wires to anyone else. She began the pre-calculation for the jump into the slipstream, a process that usually took a Thraxian computer several minutes, but which she could do in seconds thanks to the direct neural link in her cranium. She warned the crew to brace for the transition, as human ships didn't have the luxury of inertial dampeners that could fully compensate for the spatial folding. Vaelin gripped the armrests of his chair, watching the stars begin to stretch and distort as the starward bound tore a hole in the fabric of the universe. There was a moment of intense, crushing pressure, a sensation like being squeezed through a needle's eye, and then they were in the slipstream, a tunnel of swirling, iridescent colors where time and distance were mere suggestions. In the silence of the slipstream, Vaelin finally allowed himself to look at the secret he had been carrying. He pulled a small, glowing orb from a hidden compartment in his suit. It was a fragment of the ore from the Uit Reach, a substance the scientists had named Aetherium. It didn't reflect light. It seemed to generate its own from somewhere deep within its crystalline structure. As he watched, the light pulsed in time with his own heartbeat. The Accordants feared this material because they knew it was the key to unlocking the secrets of the predecessors, the ones who had built the slipstream gates and then vanished, leaving only ruins behind. The elder races had built their entire civilization on the scraps of that ancient technology, but they had never truly understood it. They were like children playing with a loaded gun, unaware of the potential for both creation and destruction that lay within. But the humans were different. They didn't just want to use the gun, they wanted to take it apart, see how it worked, and then build a better one. As the ship hurtled through the neon darkness of the slipstream, Vaelin thought about the colony on the Uit Reach. He thought about the children being born in the low-gravity nurseries, their bones growing long and thin, their minds adapted to a life among the stars. They were the first generation of a new kind of humanity, one that wouldn't be tethered to a single planet or a single sun. They were the reason he was out here, lying to Thraxians and dodging Xylanthi scouts. He knew that the peace with the Accordants wouldn't last. Eventually, the elder races would realize that the humans weren't just another minor species to be managed. They were a fundamental shift in the galactic order. They were the wild card, the unpredictable variable that would either save the galaxy or burn it to the ground. Vaelin put the Aetherium away, the glow lingering behind his eyelids for a moment after the compartment closed. He closed his eyes and tried to get some sleep, knowing that when they dropped back into real space, the real fight would begin. The transition back to normal space was violent. A sudden alarm blared through the ship, a harsh, rhythmic klaxon that signaled a proximity alert. Kalith shouted something about an interdiction field, her voice strained as she fought to keep the ship from tearing itself apart. The starward bound lurched to the port side, the metal groaning under the stress of a forced deceleration. Vaelin was thrown against his restraints, the breath leaving his lungs in a sudden rush. Through the viewscreen, he saw the cause of their distress. 3 Xylanthi interceptors, their sleek, obsidian hulls shimmering with predatory grace, were waiting for them at the exit point. They had been anticipated. The interdiction field had pulled them out of the slipstream miles away from their intended destination, leaving them stranded in the middle of a gravitational well between two dead stars. The Xylanthi didn't send a hail, they didn't offer a chance for surrender. They simply opened their weapon ports, the air in the cockpit ionizing as the enemy ships charged their primary cannons. Vaelin didn't panic. He had been in situations like this before, though usually with better odds. He ordered the crew to auxiliary power and told Calith to initiate the evasive Gamma maneuver, a desperate tactic that involved venting plasma from the engines to create a temporary cloud of interference. The starward-bound shivered as the plasma was released, a brilliant plume of violet fire blooming behind them. The first volley from the Xylanthi passed through the cloud, the beams of concentrated light refracting and losing their focus, though the heat was still enough to boil the exterior paint of the ship. Vaelin knew they couldn't win a direct engagement. Their only hope was to reach the shadow of the nearest celestial body and use its gravity to slingshot away before the Xylanthi could recalibrate their sensors. He felt the ship accelerate, the G-force pinning him to his seat as Calith pushed the engines past their safety limits. The hum of the reactor rose to a scream, a sound that vibrated in his teeth. One of the interceptors broke formation, its pilot clearly sensing their intent. It accelerated with a speed that no human ship could match, its sleek form cutting through the plasma cloud like a knife through silk. It fired a secondary battery of kinetic harpoons designed to puncture the hull and reel the target in for boarding. Vaelin watched as the harpoons streaked toward them, glowing red from the friction of their passage. "Brace," he yelled, just as the first harpoon struck. The ship rocked violently, the sound of tearing metal echoing through the corridors. A decompression alarm joined the chorus of warnings, but the hull held mostly. The harpoon had lodged itself in the cargo bay, its jagged barbs preventing it from being easily dislodged. The starward bound was now tethered to its hunter, the two ships spinning in a deadly embrace. Vaelin looked at the tactical display, his mind racing through possibilities. He could order the cargo bay to be jettisoned, but that would mean losing the supplies the colony so desperately needed. Or he could do something much more dangerous. "Calith, give me manual control of the cargo clamps," Vaelin commanded, his voice eerily steady. He saw the hesitation in her cybernetic eyes, but she complied. He began to input a series of commands into his console, overriding the safety protocols that prevented the clamps from firing while the bay was pressurized. He waited until the Xylanthi ship began to reel them in, drawing the two vessels closer together. He could see the individual plates of the enemy's armor now, the intricate carvings that depicted the glorious victories of the hegemony. He waited until they were less than 50 meters apart, the tension on the harpoon cable reaching a critical point. "Now," he whispered, and slammed his fist onto the release. Instead of simply letting go, the clamps fired outward with the force of a pneumatic hammer. The sudden release of tension, combined with the explosive decompression of the airlock, sent the starward bound spinning away in one direction and the Xylanthi interceptor tumbling in the other. The maneuver worked, but at a cost. The structural integrity of the ship was compromised, and they were still trapped in the gravity well of the twin stars. The other two interceptors were closing in, their movements more cautious now, wary of the prey that bit back. Vaelin looked at the sensor readout and saw a faint signal, a rhythmic pulsing that shouldn't have been there. It was coming from the larger of the two dead stars, a white dwarf that was slowly being consumed by its companion. The pulse was familiar. It was the same frequency as the Aetherium orb in his pocket. He realized then that the Uit Reach wasn't the only place where the predecessors had left their mark. This entire system was a tomb, and the stars themselves were the candles. He made a split-second decision that would either save them or ensure their names were never spoken again. He ordered Calith to steer the ship directly toward the white dwarf, right into the heart of the gravitational distortion. The crew was silent, the weight of the decision hanging in the air like a physical presence. They knew that no ship had ever survived the tidal forces of a white dwarf at such close range, especially not one as damaged as the Starward Bound. But they also knew that the Zolanthi wouldn't follow them there. To the hegemony, death in battle was honorable, but death by environmental hazard was a waste of resources. As they dove toward the star, the light grew blinding, a brilliant, cold white that washed out everything else. The ship began to groan, the very atoms of its structure protesting the strain. Vaelin pulled the Aetherium orb from his pocket and held it up to the view screen. The orb began to glow with an intensity that rivaled the star, its light pulsing faster and faster until it was a solid beam of radiance. He felt a sudden, profound connection to the ship, to the star, and to the silent void between them. For a moment, he wasn't just a man in a metal box. He was a part of a cosmic mechanism, a gear turning in a machine of infinite complexity. The Zolanthi interceptors flared their engines and peeled away, unable to match the suicidal trajectory of the human vessel. They watched from a safe distance as the Starward Bound was swallowed by the glare of the white dwarf. To their senses, the ship simply ceased to exist, crushed into nothingness by the overwhelming gravity. But inside the cockpit, Vaelin felt a sensation of weightlessness more absolute than any he had ever experienced. The screaming of the engines stopped, replaced by a low, melodic hum that seemed to resonate in his very marrow. The viewscreen didn't show the surface of a star. It showed a vast, crystalline structure, a city of light built into the very core of the celestial body. They had passed through a gateway, a hidden entrance that required a specific resonance to open. Vaelin looked down at the Aetherium orb, which was now quiescent, its purpose served. They were no longer in the Uat Reach, and they were no longer being hunted. They were in the heart of the mystery, the place where the ancestors of all life had gone to sleep. He looked at Calith, whose cybernetic eyes were wide with wonder, and he knew that the story of humanity was only just beginning. The transition into the interior of the white dwarf was not a descent into fire, but a passage into an impossible geometry of light and solidified energy. Vaelin watched the telemetry on his console flicker and then die, replaced by a series of glyphs that matched the etchings on the Aetherium orb. The ship was no longer being propelled by its fusion torch. Instead, it was being drawn forward by an unseen current, a river of gravitational potential that ignored the mass of the vessel entirely. Calith sat motionless, her neural link flooded with data that her cybernetic implants could barely translate. She described it as a sensory overload of mathematics, a place where the distance between 2 points was determined by intent rather than physical space. The rest of the crew remained in their seats, paralyzed by the sheer scale of the architecture rising around them. They were drifting through a cathedral of glass and pale gold, where pillars the size of planetary diameters supported a ceiling of contained fusion. This was the Sanctorum, a relic of the first architects that the Accordants had spent 3 millennia searching for, and it had been hidden inside a dying star all along, protected by a lock that only a specific isotopic signature could open. Vaelin unbuckled his restraints, his body feeling oddly buoyant in the artificial environment. The air inside the cabin had changed. It felt energized, tasting of cold iron and ozone, but it remained breathable. He walked to the primary view screen, which was now displaying a panorama of the interior city. It was not a city in the human sense of the word. There were no streets or dwellings, but rather a gargantuan array of processing nodes and energy conduits. He realized that the white dwarf was not just a celestial body, but a massive computer, a stellar-class processor fueled by the gravitational collapse of the star itself. The humans had stumbled into the hard drive of the universe. He looked at the Aetherium fragment in his hand and noticed that it was slowly dissolving, its substance turning into a fine mist that drifted toward the ship's ventilation system. As the mist spread, the ship's internal systems began to react. The flickering lights stabilized, the groaning of the damaged hull subsided, and the holographic interfaces began to glow with a clarity they had never possessed before. The ship was being integrated into the Sanctorum's network. Kalith finally spoke, her voice sounding hollow as if she was speaking from a great distance. She informed Vaelin that the ship's computer was being overwritten by a non-biological intelligence. It wasn't a hostile takeover, it felt more like an ancient system recognizing a long-lost peripheral device. The starward bound was being repaired, with nanites harvested from the surrounding light. The jagged hole in the cargo bay was sealing itself, the metal flowing like liquid until the seal was perfect once more. This level of technology was beyond anything the Thraxians or Xylanthi could conceive, yet it was being applied to their battered freighter with the casual indifference of a gardener pruning a shrub. Vaelin felt a sense of profound humility. Humanity had spent centuries fighting for a seat at the table of the Accordance, desperate to be recognized as equals by races that were themselves nothing more than scavengers in the ruins of this greatness. He realized then that the conflict between the hegemony and the human colonies was a squabble between ants over a single grain of sugar, while a banquet laid untouched just inches away. The current pulled them toward a central spire that pulsed with a soft, rhythmic amber light. As they approached, a docking aperture opened, its edges shimmering with the same hard light technology the Thraxians used, but refined to a degree that made the administrator's kiosk look like a crude toy. The ship slid into the berth with a silent grace, and the artificial gravity of the Sanctorum took hold. It was a perfect one-to-one ratio of Earth's gravity, a deliberate calibration that sent a chill through Vaelin's spine. The architects had known they were coming, or perhaps they had designed the entire system with the biological requirements of a species like humanity in mind. He ordered the crew to stay on the ship and maintain a state of high alert, though he knew that if the Sanctorum wanted them dead, they would have been pulverized the moment they crossed the event horizon. He grabbed a handheld scanner and a pulse pistol, more out of habit than a belief that it would be effective, and stepped toward the airlock. Kalith unhooked her neural interface and followed him, her mechanical eyes whirring as she attempted to record every detail of the alien environment. The airlock hissed open, revealing a platform made of a translucent material that felt like solid diamond under his boots. There was no sound here, only the low-frequency vibration of the star's core. The air was perfectly filtered, devoid of the metallic tang of the station or the stale recycled scent of the ship. Vaelin and Kalith walked toward the center of the spire, their footsteps echoing in the vast, open space. As they moved, the walls reacted to their presence, displaying flickering images of star charts, biological blueprints, and historical records that spanned millions of years. Vaelin saw the rise and fall of civilizations he had never heard of, empires that had spanned entire clusters only to vanish without a trace. He saw the origin of the slipstream gates, which were not natural phenomena but artificial punctures in the fabric of space-time, designed to facilitate a galactic-scale commerce that had long since collapsed. The history of the Accordance was absent from these walls. In the grand scheme of the architects, the current masters of the galaxy were a footnote, a temporary infestation of the infrastructure. At the center of the spire stood a pedestal holding a sphere of pure liquid mercury that defied the local gravity, spinning in a slow, hypnotic orbit. As Vaelin approached, the sphere began to change shape, forming a humanoid silhouette that lacked any defining features. It was a mirror, reflecting Vaelin's own image back at him, but with a clarity that felt invasive. A voice began to resonate not in the air, but directly within his auditory cortex. It did not use words so much as it projected concepts and emotions. It identified itself as a warden, an automated subroutine left behind to maintain the Sanctorum and monitor the development of the seeded worlds. Vaelin felt a surge of adrenaline. The term seeded implied a level of directed evolution that turned human history into a laboratory experiment. He asked the warden why they were here and what the Aetherium was for. The warden's form shifted into a representation of the Uit Reach, showing the hidden caches of memory ores buried deep within the ice. The Aetherium was a beacon, a trial designed to test the curiosity and technical aptitude of a species. Only those who could find the ore, understand its resonance, and brave the heart of a dying star were deemed ready for the next phase. Kalith stepped forward, her cybernetic eyes flashing as she attempted to download the data streaming from the pedestal. The warden allowed it, its liquid form rippling with what Vaelin interpreted as a sense of curiosity. It explained that the Accordants had failed the test millennia ago. They had found the gates, but they had used them only for conquest and stagnant preservation. They had never sought the source. They had never looked into the fire. Humanity, with its reckless disregard for its own safety and its insatiable need to know what lay behind the curtain, had reached the Sanctorum in record time. But this achievement came with a heavy burden. The warden informed them that the galaxy was currently in a state of terminal entropy. The slipstream gates were failing because the power source at the galactic core was being drained by an external force, a predator from the void between galaxies that the architects had died trying to contain. The mineral the humans were mining was not just a fuel, it was the raw code required to restart the galactic engine. Vaelin felt the weight of the revelation pressing down on him. The Xylanthi were hunting them for the Aetherium because they thought it was a weapon or a simple energy source, but it was actually the last hope for the entire biological ecosystem of the sector. If the humans kept the secret to themselves, they could potentially use the Sanctorum to elevate their species above all others, becoming the new architects. If they shared it, they risked the Accordants misusing the power and accelerating the collapse. The warden remained neutral, a silent observer waiting for a decision. It told Vaelin that the interdiction field that had nearly destroyed them was a symptom of the growing instability in the slipstream. The predator, the Void Eater, was already here, its influence manifesting as the gravitational anomalies and the sudden disappearance of peripheral star systems. The Accordance was too blinded by their internal politics to see the encroaching darkness, but humanity, living on the ragged edge of the void, had seen the signs. The conversation was interrupted by a violent tremor that shook the spire. Kalith checked her handheld display and swore. The Xylanthi had not given up. They had deployed a heavy-duty gravitational anchor, a device used for stabilizing wormholes, to hold the event horizon of the white dwarf open. They were pouring into the Sanctorum's outer shell, their ships protected by experimental shields that allowed them to withstand the tidal forces for a limited time. The hegemony was not here for diplomacy. They had seen the starward bound disappear into the star and had correctly surmised that a great treasure lay within. They were coming to claim it, and they would burn the Sanctorum to the ground if it meant they could hold the ashes. Vaelin looked at the warden, asking if the Sanctorum had defenses. The warden replied that its purpose was to preserve knowledge, not to wage war. The defenses had been decommissioned long ago to provide more power to the archives. The protection of the Sanctorum now fell to the ones who had unlocked it. Vaelin turned to Kalith and told her to get back to the ship. They needed to coordinate with the warden to use the spire's internal energy conduits to boost the Starward Bound's kinetic batteries. The warden agreed to grant them temporary administrative access to the ship tethering systems. Vaelin felt a strange sensation as a neural interface port emerged from the floor, inviting him to connect directly to the Sanctorum's defense grid. He didn't hesitate. He knelt and pressed his palm against the cold, liquid metal. His mind was instantly flooded with the perspective of the star itself. He could see the Xylanthi fleet, 12 cruisers and a mothership, moving through the crystalline passages like parasites. He could feel the heat of their engines and the cold intent of their pilots. Through the connection, he realized that the Starward Bound was no longer just a freighter. It was a focal point for the Sanctorum's power. He could channel the gravitational energy of the White Dwarf through the ship's hull, turning their humble vessel into a weapon of cosmic proportions. The Xylanthi cruisers opened fire as they entered the central chamber, their plasma lances striking the translucent walls of the spire. The structure held, but the energy was being bled off into the star's core, causing the White Dwarf to pulse erratically. Vaelin, through his link with the Warden, redirected that energy. He told Kalith to prepare the ship for a high-output discharge. On the view screen of the Starward Bound, the crew saw the Aetherium mist coalesce into a blinding spear of light that extended from the ship's prow. It wasn't a laser or a particle beam. It was a localized collapse of space-time. Vaelin targeted the lead Xylanthi cruiser and pulled the distance between them to zero. The cruiser didn't explode. It was simply folded into a space smaller than an atom. The sudden vacuum left behind created a shockwave that sent the other ships reeling. The Xylanthi pilots, usually fearless, hesitated. They were fighting something that ignored the fundamental rules of engagement, but the hegemony was nothing if not persistent. The mothership, a gargantuan vessel shaped like a jagged obsidian tooth, moved forward, its shields glowing a violent crimson. It began to fire its primary weapon, a singularity cannon that threatened to destabilize the entire spire. Vaelin felt the strain of the connection. His human brain was not designed to process the sheer volume of data required to manipulate gravitational fields. His nose began to bleed, and a dull ache throbbed behind his eyes. He saw Kalith on the ship's bridge, her hands flying across the controls as she managed the power flow to ensure the Starward Bound didn't melt from the inside out. They were a bridge between two worlds, the fragile biology of Earth acting as the catalyst for the ancient power of the first architects. Vaelin focused his will, drawing more energy from the star, feeling the heat of the fusion process burning through his neural pathways. He didn't just want to destroy the Xylanthi, he wanted to send a message to the entire accordance. He coordinated with the Warden to create a series of micro-wormholes around the Xylanthi fleet. Instead of crushing them, he used the portals to redirect their own fire back at them. The mothership's singularity rounds emerged from the void and struck its own escort cruisers, obliterating them in bursts of dark matter. The chaos was absolute. The Xylanthi, whose doctrine was based on overwhelming force and rigid hierarchy, fell into a panic as their own weapons became their greatest threat. Vaelin watched through his cosmic eyes as the mothership attempted to retreat, its engines flaring as it tried to break the gravitational anchor. He could have let them go, but he knew that if they escaped, they would return with the full might of the hegemony. He reached out with a thought and severed the gravitational anchor, not by destroying the device, but by accelerating the time dilation around it until the metal aged 1 billion years in a second and crumbled into dust. The mothership, suddenly freed from the anchor but still caught in the White Dwarf's pull, was dragged toward the event horizon. It didn't fall into the star. It was caught in a permanent temporal loop at the edge of the horizon, frozen in a moment of eternal destruction. It would serve as a warning to any who dared to enter the Sanctorum without the key. Vaelin pulled his hand away from the liquid metal interface, his body collapsing onto the diamond floor. The connection severed, leaving him feeling small, cold, and incredibly tired. Kalith was by his side in an instant, her cybernetic eyes scanning his vitals. He was alive, but the experience had changed him. His irises now had a faint, golden shimmer, and he could still hear the low hum of the star in the back of his mind. The Warden's form returned to its humanoid shape, standing over them with an expression of what might have been respect. The Warden informed them that the immediate threat had been neutralized, but the victory was a Pyrrhic one. The energy used to defend the spire had further destabilized the galactic core. The humans had the key, but the lock was breaking. The Warden provided a final data shard, a map of the other sanctorums hidden throughout the galaxy. To save the slipstream and stop the Void Eater, humanity would have to find all the fragments of the memory ores and bring them to the central hub at the galactic center. This was no longer a mission for a single freighter. It was a call to arms for the entire human race. Vaelin looked at the shard, its surface etched with the coordinates of a dozen dead stars and forgotten nebulae. He knew that the Accordants would brand them as outlaws, terrorists who had stolen the secrets of the gods. He knew that the path ahead was one of constant warfare and unimaginable danger. He stood up, leaning on Calith for support, and looked out at the vast, crystalline city. He thought about the colony in the Uat Reach, the people who were just trying to survive in a cold, indifferent universe. They were no longer just miners, they were the guardians of the legacy. He felt a strange sense of peace. For the first time in history, humanity wasn't just reacting to the galaxy, they were shaping it. They had moved from the periphery to the center of the story. They walked back to the Starward Bound, the ship looking remarkably pristine after its nanite repairs. As the airlock closed, Vaelin looked back at the Warden one last time. The liquid figure gave a small, solemn nod before dissolving back into the Mercury pedestal. The ship detached from the spire and began its journey back to the surface of the star, guided by the Sanctorum's own currents. The journey out was smoother than the journey in. The star seemed to part for them, the intense gravity acting as a slingshot that propelled them back into the slipstream with a speed that defied traditional physics. As they entered the iridescent tunnel, Vaelin took his seat in the command chair. He looked at his crew, the 12 men and women who had witnessed the impossible. They looked back at him with a mixture of awe and determination. They weren't the same people who had left Prime Junction. They were the crew of the first vessel to touch the heart of the galaxy. Vaelin opened a secure channel to the Uat Reach colony. He didn't use the standard accordance frequencies. He used the new modulated signal the Warden had given him. He told them to prepare for a mass exodus. They were moving, not to another asteroid or a distant moon, but to the stars themselves. He told them that the era of the accordance was over and the era of the human had begun. As the Starward Bound hurtled through the void, Vaelin watched the stars flickering in the distance. He knew that each of those lights represented a potential battlefield, a puzzle to be solved, or a secret to be uncovered. He knew that the Void Eater was watching, a shadow in the dark that was beginning to notice the new light burning in the heart of the galaxy. He didn't care. Humans had always been at their best when their backs were against the wall and the odds were impossible. He gripped the armrests of his chair, the golden shimmer in his eyes reflecting the swirling colors of the slipstream. They had the map, they had the key, and they had the fire. Now all they needed was the courage to see it through to the end. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening to the heartbeat of the star that still pulsed in his blood, and then he gave the order to accelerate. The return to the Uat Reach was not the triumphant homecoming Vaelin Thorne had envisioned. As the Starward Bound exited the slipstream, the sensors immediately flagged a dozen different emergency beacons scattered across the asteroid belt. The human colony, once a collection of pressurized domes and mining rigs hidden within the hollowed-out carcass of a massive planetoid, was under siege. Not by the Xylanthi, whose fleet still languished in the temporal distortion of the White Dwarf, but by a fleet of scavengers and privateers known as the Syndicate of the Broken Sun. These were the opportunists of the galaxy, the jackals that followed in the wake of the hegemony to pick the bones of those who had been softened by the elder races. They had seen the Xylanthi ships heading toward the star and had correctly guessed that the human outpost would be left undefended. Vaelin stared at the tactical display, his golden-flecked eyes narrowing as he processed the carnage. 2 of the 3 primary transport hulls were venting atmosphere, and the mining laser, repurposed for defense, was firing sporadically at a swarm of light raiders. The internal comms of the Starward Bound crackled with a frantic message from the colony's governor, a man named Harlan who had spent 40 years breathing recycled air and dreaming of a world with real soil. Harlan reported that the syndicate had already landed boarding parties in the agricultural sector, intent on seizing the hydroponic bays and the Aetherium stockpiles. Vaelin knew that if the agricultural sector fell, the colony was dead regardless of who won the space battle. He looked at Calith, who was already recalibrating the ship's new systems. The starward bound was no longer the fragile tug it had been. It was a vessel infused with the raw energy of the Sanctorum. The hull shimmered with a faint, iridescent film of nanites that absorbed and redistributed kinetic energy. Vaelin ordered the crew to battle stations, but this time the order felt different. There was no fear in the cockpit, only a cold, clinical efficiency. They had seen the heart of a star. A pack of pirates was merely a nuisance to be cleared. Vaelin didn't engage the raiders with conventional tactics. He commanded Calith to synchronize the ship's reactor with the Aetherium fragment he had retrieved. As the connection solidified, the ship didn't just move, it blinked. To the syndicate pilots, the human freighter seemed to teleport, reappearing behind their lead frigate in a burst of white light. Vaelin didn't fire a kinetic slug. Instead, he projected a localized gravitational shear, a technique he had learned while merged with the Warden's consciousness. The space around the syndicate frigate twisted, and the pirate vessel was crumpled like a piece of parchment in an invisible fist. There was no explosion, only the sound of grinding metal transmitted through the gravitational waves. The other raiders scattered, their formation breaking as their pilots struggled to understand what kind of weapon could bypass their energy shields and hull integrity with such ease. As they cleared the path toward the colony's main docking bay, Vaelin felt the strain again. The power of the Sanctorum was not free, it demanded a cognitive price. Every time he manipulated the fabric of space, his mind had to calculate the variables that would prevent him from accidentally collapsing the starward bound along with his enemies. He could feel the neurons in his frontal lobe firing with an intensity that should have been fatal, yet the Aetherium mist in the ship's air seemed to be repairing his cellular damage as fast as it occurred. He was a biological bridge for a stellar-level intelligence, and the sensation was both intoxicating and terrifying. He told Calith to bring them in close to the agricultural dome. They weren't going to dock, they were going to perform a high-altitude insertion. He gathered a team of 4, the toughest miners and mechanics on the ship, and headed to the deployment bay. They were armed with standard-issue human rifles, but Vaelin had something more, a handheld projector linked to the ship's core. The drop was a blur of motion. They descended through the thin, artificial atmosphere of the dome on grav boards, the wind whistling past their helmets. Below them, the syndicate boarding parties were recognizable by their mismatched armor and the brutal, serrated blades they favored for close-quarters combat. They were rounding up the human colonists, herding them toward the cargo shuttles. Vaelin hit the ground first, the impact cushioned by a pulse from his projector. He didn't wait for his team to form up. He sprinted toward the nearest group of pirates, his projector humming. When he fired, it wasn't a bolt of energy that emerged, but a distortion of reality. The syndicate soldiers didn't die in the traditional sense, they were simply moved. One moment they were standing on the deck, the next they were 500 meters outside the dome, floating in the airless void. The efficiency of the removal was chilling. Within minutes, the agricultural sector was cleared of enemies, the survivors of the boarding parties retreating in a state of absolute terror. Vaelin found Harlan in the central control room, the older man's face covered in soot and blood. Harlan looked at Vaelin, and then at the shimmering gold in Vaelin's eyes, and he took a step back. He asked what had happened at the Star and what Vaelin had become. Vaelin didn't have time for explanations. He told Harlan to initiate the Phoenix Protocol, a plan they had discussed only in hushed whispers as a worst-case scenario. The Uit Reach was no longer safe. The Accordance would eventually send more than just a few Xylanthi scouts, and the Syndicate would return in greater numbers. They needed to move the entire colony. Harlan protested, pointing out that an asteroid base wasn't a ship. It didn't have engines, only small thrusters for orbital correction. Vaelin placed his hand on the primary environmental console and let the Sanctorum's code flow from his mind into the colony's archaic computer. He told Harlan that they weren't going to fly the asteroid, they were going to jump it. The plan was madness, even by human standards. Vaelin intended to use the Starward Bound as a focal point to wrap the entire Uit Reach colony in a slipstream bubble. It was a feat of engineering that the Thraxians would have claimed was mathematically impossible, yet Vaelin could see the equations forming in his mind, clear as mountain water. He returned to the ship, leaving Harlan to manage the panicked population. Back on the bridge, Kalith looked exhausted, her cybernetic eyes dimming as her power reserves ran low. Vaelin took the pilot's seat next to her, placing his hands on the controls. He felt the ship's consciousness merge with his own once more. He reached out with his mind, feeling the mass of the asteroid, the 3,000 hearts beating within it, and the cold, vast emptiness surrounding them. He began to draw power not just from the ship's reactor, but from the Aetherium deposits still buried deep within the rock. The asteroid began to glow, a pale, ghostly blue light radiating from the cracks in the ice. The Syndicate ships still in the area tried to flee, but they were caught in the growing gravitational wake. Vaelin ignored them. He was focused on the point in space ahead of them, a tiny speck of darkness that he was slowly widening into a maw. The stress on the Starward Bound was immense. The hull plates began to glow red-hot, and the smell of ozone became overpowering. Vaelin's vision began to tunnel, the gold in his eyes flaring until it was the only thing he could see. He screamed, a sound of pure mental agony, as he forced the laws of physics to bend to his will. With a final, violent lurch that felt like the universe was being torn in half, the Uit Reach colony vanished from the sector. They left behind nothing but a cloud of ionized gas and a group of very confused pirates who would soon have to explain to their employers how an entire planetoid had simply walked away. When Vaelin regained consciousness, he was lying on the floor of the bridge. The Starward Bound was silent, drifting in a place that was neither the slipstream nor normal space. It was a pocket dimension, a between space that the Warden had described as a temporary refuge. Outside the view screen, the asteroid was still there, held in a stable orbit around a shimmering artificial sun that Vaelin had inadvertently created during the jump. The colony was safe, but they were now truly alone, cut off from the rest of humanity and the Accordants alike. Kalith was slumped over her console, her breathing shallow but steady. Vaelin crawled to his feet, his muscles aching as if he had run a marathon. He looked at the data shard from the Warden, which was now glowing with a new set of coordinates. Their first jump had been successful, but it had only been a short hop compared to the journey that lay ahead. He walked to the observation deck and looked out at the colony. He could see the lights of the residential domes flickering back to life. He imagined the people inside, the families who had just survived the most harrowing experience of their lives, only to find themselves in a strange new corner of the universe. He knew they would be afraid, and he knew they would look to him for answers he didn't fully have. But he also felt a surge of pride. They had done what no other species had ever dared to do. They had moved a world. This was the true strength of humanity, not their weapons or their technology, but their refusal to accept the limitations placed upon them. They were a species of survivors, of explorers who would rather jump into the unknown than die in a familiar cage. Vaelin wiped the blood from his nose and took a deep breath of the air, which still tasted of the star's fire. A message appeared on the main screen, a transmission from the colony's science laid. A woman named Miora, who had been studying the Aetherium since the first day they arrived at the Reach. She informed Vaelin that the jump had triggered a transformation in the ore. The deposits were no longer just glowing rocks. They were beginning to grow, forming crystalline structures that were integrating themselves into the colony's life support and power grids. The asteroid was evolving, becoming a living machine. Miura was ecstatic, but Vaelin felt a pang of concern. They were becoming something other than human, something more closely aligned with the architects. He wondered if this was the price of survival, to lose the very thing they were fighting to protect. He thought about the warden's warning about the Void Eater and realized that the transformation might be necessary. To fight a predator that ate galaxies, they couldn't just be men, they had to be something more. He ordered the crew to begin repairs on the starward bound. They had a long way to go before they reached the next sanctorum, and the ship was currently held together by little more than nanites and luck. He spent the next few hours in the medbay, where the ship's automated systems treated his neural strain. As he lay there, he found that he could still feel the presence of the other sanctorums, like distant bells ringing in the back of his mind. He could feel the instability of the galaxy, the way the slipstream was fraying at the edges. Time was running out. The Accordance was likely in a state of chaos, blaming each other for the disappearance of the human colony and the loss of the Xylanthi fleet. They would eventually figure out where the humans had gone, or at least how they had done it. The hunt would resume, and next time the elder races wouldn't send scouts, they would send their gods. Vaelin eventually returned to the bridge, finding Kalith awake and nursing a cup of synthetic coffee. She looked at him with her mechanical eyes, her expression unreadable. She asked him if he thought they could actually do it, find all the fragments and restart the core. Vaelin didn't answer right away. He looked out at the artificial sun, the light of it reflected in the glass of the viewscreen. He told her that he didn't know if they could, but he knew that they were the only ones who would try. The elder races were content to watch the lights go out, as long as they were the last ones in the dark. Humans, however, had spent their entire history fighting against the night. It was in their DNA to strike a match, even if the world was made of gasoline. Kalith nodded, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. She began to input the coordinates for the next jump, her fingers moving with a newfound confidence. As the starward bound prepared to leave the pocket dimension, Vaelin sent a final message to the colony. He told them to keep mining, to keep building, and to be ready for the day when he returned. He told them that they were the vanguard of a new era, the first citizens of a galaxy that was being reborn. He didn't tell them about the Void Eater or the cosmic cost of their new power. Some truths were too heavy for a people who had just found a new home. He took his seat in the command chair, his hands hovering over the controls. The golden light in his eyes flared one last time as he initiated the jump. The starward bound vanished from the pocket dimension, leaving the asteroid colony behind in its shimmering cradle. They were heading toward a nebula on the far side of the Perseus Arm, a place where the stars were born in clouds of violet dust. It was the location of the second sanctorum, and Vaelin could already feel its pulse, calling him home. The journey ahead would be defined by blood and fire, but for the first time in his life, Vaelin Thorne felt as though he was exactly where he was meant to be. He wasn't just a man on a ship. He was the spearhead of a species that refused to be forgotten. As the iridescent walls of the slipstream closed around them, he leaned back and allowed the hum of the universe to fill his mind. They were hunters now, chasing the secrets of the creators, and nothing in the accordance or the void beyond would stand in their way. The weight of the feather had become the strength of the mountain, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The Perseus Arm was a graveyard of ancient light, a sprawling expanse of stellar nurseries and collapsing gas clouds that the Accordance had long ago deemed too volatile for colonization. As the starward bound emerged from the slipstream, the viewscreen was filled with the violent beauty of the Amaranthine Nebula. Swirls of deep violet and bruised gold stretched for light years in every direction, the dense particulate matter playing havoc with the ship's conventional sensors. Vaelin Thorne stood at the forward console, the golden luminescence in his eyes pulsing in a slow, rhythmic cadence that mirrored the ship's reactor. They had been traveling for weeks, hopping between the frayed edges of the slipstream to avoid the Xylanthi patrols that were now scouring the sector. The news of the Uit Reach's disappearance had turned the galaxy into a tinderbox. The Thraxians had declared humanity a transversal threat, a legal designation that essentially authorized any Accordance member to fire on sight. Vaelin felt the weight of that hostility, but it felt distant, like the buzzing of a fly against a windowpane. Kalith was slumped in her seat, her neural link glowing a dull, overworked amber. She had been tasked with filtering the nebula's interference to find the specific resonance of the second sanctorum. Unlike the first, which had been hidden within a white dwarf, this one was buried in the heart of a planetary fragment, a world that had been shattered during the Architect's final stand against the Void Eater. She signaled a hit, her voice a raspy whisper. The signal was buried deep within a cluster of rogue planetoids that were being whipped around by a localized gravity well. It wasn't just a physical barrier. The space here was soft, a term navigators used for regions where the laws of physics were beginning to unravel. Vaelin ordered the ship into the cluster, his fingers brushing the controls. He could feel the sanctorum's call now, a sharp, crystalline frequency that vibrated in his teeth. It was different from the first, more aggressive, more desperate. It felt like a distress signal that had been looping for 10 million years. As they navigated the labyrinth of spinning rock and ionizing radiation, the ship's proximity alerts flared. They weren't alone. Emergent from the violet clouds was a vessel that looked nothing like the sleek obsidian of the Xylanthi or the blocky freighters of the Thraxians. It was a jagged, asymmetrical construct of bone-white ceramic and shifting geometry. Vaelin recognized the design from the archives in the first sanctorum. This was a harvester, a remnant of the automated swarms the Void Eater used to strip mine the reality of its energy. It was a scout for the predator they had been warned about. The harvester didn't move like a ship. It twitched through space, its movement jagged and unnatural. It fired a beam of null light, a substance that didn't burn or explode, but simply erased the matter it touched. Vaelin reacted instinctively, pulling the starward bound into a tight roll while projecting a field of Aetherium resonance. The null light struck the field and dissolved into harmless sparks, but the drain on the ship's core was immense. The crew was thrown into a frenzy of activity. This wasn't a fight against a political rival. It was a struggle against an existential erasure. Vaelin realized that the harvester was tethered to the very sanctorum they were seeking, feeding on its residual power like a parasite. He told Kalith to divert all auxiliary power to the prow. They couldn't outgun the harvester with kinetics, and their gravitational manipulation was too taxing for a sustained engagement. Instead, they would use the ship itself as a needle. Vaelin tapped into the Warden's code, his mind expanding to encompass the ship's exterior hull. He didn't just want to fly, he wanted to phase. He calculated the frequency of the harvester's hull and adjusted the starward bound's atomic vibration to match. It was a suicidal gamble. If he was off by a fraction of a percent, the two vessels would fuse into a solid mass of twisted metal. He saw Kalith's wide, terrified eyes and gave her a sharp, determined nod. The starward bound accelerated, the hum of the engine rising to a pitch that shattered the glass of the auxiliary displays. They struck the harvester at a significant fraction of light speed, but there was no impact. The human ship passed through the alien construct like a ghost through a wall. For a split second, Vaelin was inside the harvester's consciousness. He felt a cold, infinite hunger, a void that could never be filled, and the screaming memories of 1,000 consumed worlds. Then they were through. The harvester, its internal integrity disrupted by the ship's passage, began to collapse inward, its ceramic hull turning to dust as the null light it contained turned on its host. The explosion was silent, a ripple of non-existence that left a hole in the nebula. Vaelin gasped, his lungs burning, the golden light in his eyes fading to a dull glimmer. They had survived, but the encounter had left a mark on his soul. The Voidita wasn't just a monster, it was the end of all things. They reached the planetary fragment, a jagged crescent of rock that had once been a lush garden world. At its center sat the Sanctorum of the Bloom. Unlike the crystalline spire of the first station, this one was biological. Massive, bioluminescent vines the size of skyscrapers wound through the ruins, their leaves shimmering with a metallic sheen. The Sanctorum was a greenhouse of genetic information, a vault designed to preserve the biodiversity of the galaxy. Vaelin and his landing party descended in a shuttle, landing in a courtyard that was overgrown with flowers that breathed oxygen and pulsed with the rhythm of the planet's core. The air was intoxicating, thick with the scent of 1 billion different perfumes. Kalith, her neural link still active, noted that the plants were acting as organic processors, maintaining the local atmosphere and shielding the site from the harvester's sensors. They were walking through a living computer. At the heart of the bloom, they found the second warden. This one took the form of a woman made of interwoven vines and emerald light. She didn't speak in concepts like the first. She spoke in the language of biology, her voice a rustle of leaves and the trickling of water. She informed them that the Sanctorum was dying. The harvester had been draining the life force of the vault for centuries, and the genetic sequences it held were beginning to degrade. To save the legacy, Vaelin would have to do more than just collect a data shard. He would have to host it. The second fragment of the memory core wasn't a mineral or a digital file. It was a complex sequence of synthetic DNA that needed a living vessel to survive the journey to the galactic center. Vaelin didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, allowing the warden to place a hand, cool and smelling of rain, against his chest. The transfer was an agony of a different kind. Vaelin felt his own DNA being rewritten, the ancient code of the architects weaving itself into his marrow. He saw the history of life itself, the first cells emerging from the primordial soup, the rise of the first sentient beings, and the tragic mistake that had allowed the Voidita to cross the threshold. He saw that the architects hadn't just built the gates, they had sacrificed their own biological essence to create the barriers that held the shadow at bay. Humanity was the failsafe, a species designed with a redundant genetic structure that could handle the strain of the memory cores. He was no longer just a man, he was a walking archive, a living library of everything the galaxy had ever been. When the warden pulled her hand away, Vaelin collapsed, his skin shimmering with a faint, green luminescence that competed with the gold in his eyes. The Sanctorum began to shake. With the harvester destroyed and the core transferred, the station's structural integrity was failing. The vines were withering, their light fading as the energy that sustained them was withdrawn. The warden gave Vaelin a final, sad smile before she dissolved into a pile of dry leaves. They had to move. The landing party carried Vaelin back to the shuttle, the ground cracking beneath their feet. As they broke the atmosphere and returned to the starward bound, they saw the Amaranthe Nebula beginning to contract. The death of the Sanctorum was creating a localized gravitational collapse. Kalith didn't wait for orders. She engaged the slipstream drive, the ship tearing a hole in the violet sky just as the planetary fragment was crushed into a singularity. They were back in the iridescent tunnel, but the silence was gone. Vaelin could hear the bloom within him, 1,000 voices of extinct species whispering in his blood. He woke up in the ship's medbay, but the automated doctors were confused. His vitals were fluctuating in patterns that didn't match any known human physiology. Miora, the science lead, was there, her face a mask of fascination and dread. She told him that his blood was now a translucent blue and that his bone density had tripled. He was becoming a hybrid, a bridge between the human and the divine. Vaelin sat up, feeling a strange, liquid grace in his movements. He looked at the data shard he had retrieved from the first Sanctorum, and now he could read it without the help of a computer. The map was no longer a series of coordinates. It was a path carved into his very soul. He knew where the third Sanctorum was, a place called the Shroud of the Nameless, located in the dark matter void between the spiral arms. He called a meeting of the crew. He told them the truth, that they were no longer just miners or explorers. They were the carriers of a dead civilization's soul. He explained that the accordance was already falling apart, their borders being eroded by the harvesters that were appearing with increasing frequency. The Xylanthi would eventually realize that the humans weren't the enemy, but by then, it would be too late. The only way to save the galaxy was to reach the core and restart the engine, but doing so would change humanity forever. They wouldn't be the masters of the galaxy, they would be its stewards, bound to the ancient machinery until the end of time. He asked if any of them wanted to leave, to be dropped off at the Uit Reach colony or a neutral station. To a man, the crew stayed. They had seen the beauty of the bloom and the horror of the harvester, and they knew that there was no going back to the way things were. Kalith approached him after the meeting. She looked at his blue-tinged skin and his shimmering eyes, and she reached out to touch his hand. She asked him if he was still Vaelin. He looked at her, and for a moment, the whispers of the extinct species fell silent. He told her that he didn't know, but he knew that he still remembered the smell of the Earth's rain and the taste of the coffee they had shared in the docks of Prime Junction. He was the anchor, the part of him that remained human, holding the vast, alien power in place. They stood together on the observation deck, watching the slipstream colors flow past. They were heading into the deep dark, the places where even the elder races feared to tread. But they weren't afraid. They were the weight of a feather that would tip the scales of the universe. Vaelin closed his eyes, listening to the dual pulse of the star and the garden within him, and prepared for the next jump. The Shroud of the Nameless was not a place of light or matter, but a vast, echoing pocket of dark energy situated in the abyssal void between the galactic core and the Sagittarius arm. As the starward bound exited the slipstream, the crew was met with a terrifying absence of stars. Here, the density of dark matter was so high that it acted as a gravitational lens, warping the light of distant galaxies into smeared, ghostly arcs. Vaelin Thorne stood on the bridge, his new physiology thrumming in resonance with the void. The synthetic DNA of the bloom had fully integrated into his system, turning his veins into luminous conduits of cerulean light. He no longer required the ship's internal sensors to navigate. He could feel the third sanctorum like a cold, heavy weight pulling at his consciousness. It was the sanctorum of the Aegis, the fortress node that once controlled the galaxy's defensive grid. If the first was the memory and the second was the life, this was the muscle of the architects. The ship's hull groaned as it entered the high-density dark matter field. Kalith struggled with the helm, her cybernetic eyes flickering as the gravitational shear threatened to pull the vessel into 1,000 different directions at once. She reported that the ship's structural integrity was failing, the metal fatigue reaching critical levels. Vaelin stepped forward and placed his hands on the primary bulkhead. He didn't use the console. He projected his own refined Aetherium field directly through the ship's skin. The iridescent nanite film on the hull thickened, changing color from violet to a deep, impenetrable black. He was teaching the ship how to exist in a state of partial non-matter. The groaning stopped, replaced by a low, rhythmic vibration that sounded like a heavy heart beating in the dark. They were no longer fighting the void, they were becoming a part of it. Vaelin's mind was stretched thin, anchored to the ship on one side and the distant sanctorum on the other, but the human core of his spirit remained unyielding. As they drew closer to the coordinates, the sensors picked up a massive structure. It was a ring, millions of miles in diameter, encircling a singularity that had been tamed and harnessed as a power source. This was the Aegis, but it was not the silent ruin they had expected. The ring was crawling with activity. Thousands of Xylanthi warships were tethered to the structure, their obsidian hulls illuminated by the harsh, artificial glare of fusion torches. The hegemony had found the Aegis months ago, and they were attempting to strip it for parts. They were cutting into the ancient machinery with plasma saws, unaware that they were dismantling the very shield that kept the Void Eater at bay. Vaelin felt a surge of cold fury. The elder races were like children playing with a dam during a flood, pulling out stones to build their own tiny walls while the water rose above their heads. He ordered the crew to silent running, though he knew that their Aetherium signature was like a flare in the dark to anyone who knew what to look for. The Xylanthi command ship, a dreadnought named the Iron Maw, detached from the ring and began to move toward them. It was a behemoth of iron and arrogance, its weapons systems charging with enough power to crack a moon. Vaelin knew they couldn't win a direct engagement, even with his new abilities. He needed to reach the central hub of the Aegis to activate the third Warden. He told Calith to prepare for a shadow jump, a maneuver that involved momentarily sliding the ship into the dark matter dimension. It was a move that would have vaporized a normal human crew, but Vaelin's presence provided a protective envelope. They jumped, the world turning into a kaleidoscope of inverted colors and crushing pressure, and reappeared directly inside the Aegis's internal docking bay, bypassing the Xylanthi blockade entirely. The transition left the crew gasping for air, but Vaelin was already out of his chair, his feet hitting the cold, metallic floor of the fortress. The interior of the Aegis was a stark contrast to the garden-like bloom. It was a cathedral of obsidian and steel, filled with the hum of high-voltage conduits and the scent of scorched air. Vaelin led his team toward the central core, their boots echoing in the vast, sterile hallways. They encountered Xylanthi boarding parties, warriors in heavy power armor who moved with a practiced, lethal grace. Vaelin didn't use his rifle. He raised his hand, and the very shadows of the hallway rose up to meet the invaders. He wasn't killing them with light. He was using the dark matter of the shroud to pin them against the walls, freezing them in a stasis field where time moved at a glacial pace. He moved past them like a god, walking through a gallery of statues. He felt the Aegis recognizing him, the ancient security systems deactivating as his synthetic DNA broadcast the clearance codes of a high architect. They reached the core, a spherical chamber where the harnessed singularity hovered in a lattice of magnetic fields. The third Warden appeared, but this one was not a liquid mirror or a woman of vines. It was a towering figure of moving plates and shifting geometry, a knight of pure kinetic energy. It identified itself as the Sentinel. It didn't speak in riddles or biology. It spoke in the cold language of strategy and attrition. It informed Vaelin that the Aegis was at 3% capacity. The Xylanthi had already compromised the primary cooling arrays, and the singularity was becoming unstable. If it collapsed, it would take a significant portion of the sector with it. More importantly, the Sentinel revealed that the Void Eater was no longer a distant threat. The harvesters they had encountered were merely the feelers. The main entity had already entered the galaxy's upper plane, attracted by the very Aetherium signatures the humans were generating. The Sentinel demanded a sacrifice. To restore the Aegis and secure the third memory core, Vaelin would have to merge the Starward Bound's reactor with the station's main bus. This would effectively destroy their ship, leaving them stranded in the most hostile environment in the known universe. Vaelin looked back at his crew, Calith, Miora, and the others who had followed him into the mouth of hell. He saw the fear in their eyes, but he also saw their resolve. They were humans. They were used to making the best of a bad situation. Calith nodded, her hand resting on the data link in her neck. She told Vaelin to do it. They would find a way home, or they would die as the last line of defense for a galaxy that didn't even know it was in danger. Vaelin initiated the transfer. The Starward Bound, the ship that had been their home and their sanctuary, began to dissolve into pure energy, its matter being converted into the raw power required to jumpstart the Aegis. The effect was instantaneous. The lights in the fortress flared to a blinding brilliance, and the humming of the conduits rose to a roar. Outside, the Xylanthi ships were pushed back by a massive gravitational pulse as the Aegis's shields roared back to life. The Iron Maw was struck by a beam of concentrated dark energy that stripped away its armor, forcing the dreadnought to retreat. The Sentinel's form grew more solid, its shifting plates settling into a permanent, regal shape. It reached into the heart of the singularity and pulled out a small, heavy cube made of a material that seemed to absorb all light. This was the third fragment, the core of will. It wasn't meant to be integrated into Vaelin's body. It was a tool, a device that could project the user's intent across astronomical distances. Vaelin took the cube, and as his fingers touched the cold surface, he felt the defensive grid of the entire galaxy flickering in his mind. He could see every gate, every star, and every encroaching shadow. But the victory was short-lived. A massive tremor shook the core, and the Sentinel's light flickered. A harvester, larger than any Vaelin had seen, a World-Eater-class vessel, had emerged from the dark matter void and was currently ramming the Aegis's primary shield. The Void Eater had arrived. The entity wasn't a ship. It was a localized tier in the fabric of the universe, a manifestation of the entropy that existed before the Big Bang. It began to bleed into the Aegis, its presence causing the metal to rust and the air to turn to ash. Vaelin realized that the three fragments they had gathered were still not enough. They had the memory, the life, and the will, but they lacked the catalyst. The Sentinel informed him that the final component was located at the galactic core itself, within the Prime Sanctorum. The Aegis could hold the World Eater for a few hours, but no longer. They had to leave, and they had to leave now. With their ship gone, the Sentinel provided a final gift, a precursor transport, a sleek, needle-like vessel called the Aeon that had been stored in the Aegis's hangar for eons. It was a ship built by the architects themselves, designed for one purpose, to reach the core. Vaelin and his crew scrambled into the transport as the walls of the core began to buckle under the pressure of the Void Eater's influence. As they launched, Vaelin looked back through the rear view screen. He saw the Sentinel standing at the center of the singularity, its arms raised as it poured its own existence into the shields to buy them those precious few hours. The Aegis was a lone lighthouse in a sea of absolute darkness, being slowly consumed by a shadow that had no end. Vaelin felt a hollow ache in his chest, a mourning for the ancient guardians who were sacrificing themselves for a species they barely knew. The Aeon was a revelation of engineering. It didn't use engines in the traditional sense. It manipulated the density of spacetime in front of it, effectively falling toward its destination at speeds that made the slipstream look like a crawl. Vaelin took the pilot's seat, the core of will resting in his lap. He could feel the connection between the cube and the other two fragments within him. He was a walking trinity of cosmic power, yet he felt more fragile than ever. The synthetic DNA in his blood was starting to burn, the energy density too high for his biological vessel to contain for much longer. Miura warned him that his cellular structure was beginning to decouple. He was literally coming apart at the seams. He didn't care. He had a job to finish. He pushed the Aeon to its limit, the ship becoming a streak of white light that cut through the dark matter of the shroud and headed toward the glowing heart of the galaxy. As they traveled, Vaelin used the core of will to broadcast a message to every human colony and every accordance world. He didn't ask for help, he gave a warning. He told them that the night was coming, but that there was still a chance to hold the dawn. He spoke of the architects, of the Void Eater, and of the price of survival. The Thraxians tried to jam the signal, but the core of will bypassed their technology with ease. For the first time in history, the entire galaxy was listening to a single human voice. Some reacted with terror, others with skepticism, but on Earth and the Uit Reach, there was a sense of grim determination. The humans began to arm themselves, not for a war against each other, but for the defense of existence itself. They were the ones who had found the fire, and they would be the ones to keep it burning. The Aeon reached the edge of the galactic core, a region of space so crowded with stars that the sky was a solid wall of white fire. At the very center sat the supermassive black hole, Sagittarius A, but it was not the devouring maw the scientists had predicted. It was the Prime Sanctorum, a gargantuan Dyson sphere built around the event horizon. This was the engine of the galaxy, the source of the slipstream and the anchor of reality, but the sphere was cracked. Dark, oily tendrils of the Void Eater were already wrapping around the structure, suffocating the light of the central singularity. Vaelin felt the weight of the moment pressing down on him. They were the last hope, a handful of humans in a stolen ship, carrying the pieces of a broken god. He looked at Kalith, who reached over and gripped his hand. Her touch was the only thing that kept him from dissolving into the light. "Take us in, Vaelin," she whispered. "Finish it." He closed his eyes, and the Aeon dove into the fire. The approach to the Prime Sanctorum was a descent into a mechanical sun. The Dyson sphere surrounding Sagittarius A was a masterpiece of impossible engineering, a shell of shifting plates and energy filaments that captured the gravitons of the supermassive black hole and converted them into the lifeblood of the galaxy. But the damage was catastrophic. Great fissures, miles wide, leaked golden radiation into the void, and the oily, iridescent substance of the Void Eater had formed a parasitic lattice over the northern hemisphere of the structure. Vaelin Thorne sat in the command chair of the Aeon, his body now glowing with such intensity that the bridge crew had to wear polarized visors just to look in his direction. The synthetic DNA of the Bloom, the Aetherium of the Uit Reach, and the defensive blueprints of the Aegis were all vibrating in a discordant symphony within his marrow. He was the conductor of a dying orchestra, and the final movement was about to begin. As the Aeon pierced the outer atmospheric envelope of the sphere, they were met with a legion of harvesters. These were not the scouts or the world eaters they had faced before, but specialized sutures, designed to stitch the Void Eater's entropy into the very core of the Sanctorum. Vaelin didn't wait for the ship's automated defenses to engage. He stood up, his feet barely touching the deck plates, and extended his hands. Using the core of will, he projected a massive localized field of absolute order. The harvesters didn't explode. They were simply unmade, their chaotic, entropic structures forced back into the basic atomic components of hydrogen and carbon. The path to the central ignition chamber was cleared in a single, blinding stroke. But the cost was visible. Vaelin's skin was beginning to crack, revealing the white-hot energy flowing beneath his surface. He was no longer a man. He was a failing containment vessel for the soul of a civilization. The interior of the Prime Sanctorum was a landscape of colossal machinery and gravity-defying rivers of liquid light. Kalith piloted the Aeon through the gaps in the rotating rings of the Dyson shell, her movements instinctive and desperate. They reached the ignition core, a platform that hovered directly over the event horizon of the singularity. Here, the laws of physics were merely suggestions. Time flowed in loops, and the air was thick with the scent of ozone and ancient memories. At the center of the platform stood the final warden, the Prime. It had no shape, no voice, and no light. It was a presence, a vast and silent consciousness that had been waiting since the birth of the stars. It didn't need to explain the situation to Vaelin. Through the fragments he carried, he already knew. The engine of the galaxy had run out of meaning. The architects had built reality on the foundation of curiosity and growth, and the stagnation of the accordance had allowed the Void Eater to gain a foothold. Vaelin stepped out of the Aeon, his boots clicking on the translucent floor. His crew followed him, though they had to stay back from the heat radiating from his body. Miora, the scientist, wept as she looked at the readings on her handheld scanner. Vaelin's molecular structure was becoming a singularity of its own. He turned to look at them one last time. He saw Kalith, her mechanical eyes reflecting the golden fire of the core. He saw the miners and the mechanics who had become the unexpected guardians of the universe. He told them that humanity's role was never to be the strongest or the oldest, but to be the most persistent. They were the species that wouldn't stop asking why and wouldn't stop looking beyond. That hunger for the unknown was the only thing that could restart the engine. He reached out and touched Calith's cheek, his fingers leaving a faint, glowing brand on her skin. He told her to take the Aeon and lead the survivors back to the Uit Reach. The Voidita made its final move. A massive, shadowy limb, larger than a continent, slammed into the ignition core, shattering the platform. The Aeon was nearly crushed, but Calith managed to pull the ship into a vertical climb. Vaelin remained, hovering over the abyss of the black hole. He felt the entity's mind, a cold, infinite hunger that viewed life as a mistake to be corrected. Vaelin didn't fight it with anger. He fought it with the sum total of human experience. He channeled the memory of a child's first breath, the heat of a summer sun on Earth, the grit of a miner's hands, and the reckless hope of a navigator jumping into the dark. He integrated these human impurities into the cold logic of the architect's code. He became the catalyst. With a shout that resonated through every slipstream gate in the galaxy, Vaelin plunged himself into the heart of the singularity. The explosion was not one of fire, but of definition. A wave of golden light erupted from Sagittarius A, sweeping across the Prime Sanctorum and dissolving the parasitic corruption of the Voidita. The wave expanded outward, traveling through the slipstream at infinite speed. Every gate in the galaxy flared with new life, their failing structures reinforced by the human code Vaelin had introduced. On the Uit Reach, the Aetherium crystals turned a brilliant, stable blue. In the Xolanthe hegemony, the obsidian ships found their weapons disabled as the galaxy itself refused to allow further senseless destruction. The Voidita was not destroyed, but it was pushed back, exiled once more to the dark spaces between the galaxies. The engine was restarted, but it was no longer the cold, distant machine of the architects. It was a living, breathing system, fueled by the chaotic, beautiful potential of a species that refused to die. Back at the edge of the core, the Aeon watched as the golden light faded, replaced by the steady, healthy glow of the Dyson sphere. Vaelin Thorne was gone, but his presence was everywhere. The stars felt closer, the void felt less empty, and the slipstream hummed with a new melodic rhythm. Calith sat at the helm, her hand trembling as she touched the mark Vaelin had left on her face. She knew that the era of the Accordance was truly over. The elder races would have to learn to live in a galaxy that no longer belonged to the shadows or the bureaucrats. It belonged to the curious. She set the coordinates for home, the Aeon responding with a fluidity that suggested the ship itself was now a part of the new order. They were leaving the center of the universe, but they were carrying the fire with them. Months later, on the Uit Reach, a monument was built. It wasn't made of stone or metal, but of a single floating feather of Aetherium that pulsed with a soft, golden light. The colony had grown into a sprawling city, a hub of trade and learning where humans and the lesser races of the Accordance lived as equals. The Xolanthe and Thraxians remained in their own territories, humbled by the realization that their power was a mere shadow compared to the weight of a single human's resolve. Harlan, now an elder statesman of the New Terran Coalition, often stood by the monument and looked out at the stars. He knew that the fight wasn't over, the Voidita was patient, and the galaxy was vast. But he also knew that somewhere in the core, the engine was beating like a heart, and that the light of humanity would never again be extinguished. Calith became the first admiral of the Coalition fleet, her ship, a new vessel named the Vaelin's Grace, leading the way into the uncharted sectors of the Perseus Arm. She never spoke of what she had seen in the Prime Sanctorum, but sometimes, when the ship was in the slipstream and the colors were just right, she could hear a voice in the humming of the hull. It wasn't a god or a warden, but the voice of a man who had once been a miner, a liar, and a hero. The voice didn't give orders, it simply reminded her to keep looking forward. The weight of the feather had become the foundation of a new reality, and as the humans spread across the stars, they did so not as conquerors, but as the heirs to a legacy they had earned with their blood. The story of the architects was finished, but the story of humanity was only on its first page.